The city of Florence basked in the golden light of late summer, its cobbled streets glowing as if centuries of history had absorbed the sun and held it within the stones. Tourists wandered the piazzas, pausing to admire statues that seemed alive with silent emotion, while locals hurried through narrow alleys carrying the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee. Among the countless lives moving through the city that evening, two souls were unknowingly being drawn together, as if by invisible threads spun long before their birth. Clara Moretti was a young art restorer who had recently returned to her hometown after years of studying abroad. To her colleagues, she seemed dedicated, precise, and almost consumed by her work, yet inside her lived a quiet longing for something greater, something that could not be found within pigments or brushstrokes. Her heart carried scars from disappointments, from love that once promised eternity but crumbled into dust. She had sworn to bury those fragile dreams, convincing herself that devotion to her craft was enough. But sometimes, when she lifted her gaze from a painting's surface, she would catch her own reflection in the museum's glass, eyes filled with both strength and an unspoken plea. Adrian Keller, meanwhile, was a composer whose life had been shaped by sound more than by words. Born in Vienna, raised among symphonies and silence, he carried within him melodies that often felt too vast for any orchestra. He had come to Florence not for fame, but for escape from expectations, from relentless schedules, from a loneliness that echoed louder than any concert hall. His music, though celebrated, was haunted by an absence he could never name. He did not search for love. Instead, he wandered the city's streets like a traveler who had lost his map, hoping that somewhere, among the arches and riverbanks, he might rediscover himself. It was in the quiet halls of the Uffizi Gallery that their paths first intersected. Clara had been carefully examining a canvas, the delicate fragments of color requiring both her patience and her soul, when Adrian entered, drawn not by knowledge of art, but by a need to lose himself among beauty. He paused near the same painting, though for him it was not the brushstrokes that captured attention, but the silent presence of a woman who seemed to belong more to the world of art than to reality. Neither spoke, and neither even looked directly at the other, yet something stirred in both. Clara felt an unfamiliar awareness, as if the air had shifted, carrying a vibration she could not name. Adrian, standing only a few steps away, heard a melody take shape in his mind, notes he had never played, but that suddenly demanded to be remembered. Their first meeting was nothing more than a passing moment, brief and unremarkable to the outside world. But in the secret chambers of their hearts, a door had quietly opened. They parted without names, without words, without the faintest idea of what had begun. And yet, as Clara walked home through the dusky streets, she carried with her a strange lightness, as though the weight of solitude had been ever so slightly lifted. And Adrian, returning to his rented apartment overlooking the Arno, found himself sketching notes on a page, unaware that the melody was born not of memory, but of the nearness of a stranger. Fate had made its first move, soft and silent. The city itself seemed to conspire, church bells ringing in the distance, the river whispering beneath its bridges, the stars beginning to awaken above the rooftops. Neither Clara nor Adrian yet knew it, but their lives were on the edge of transformation. A love story, written in silence and music, was preparing to unfold. The days that followed drifted past like pages in an unfinished book. Florence, with its soft sunsets and endless murmur of footsteps on stone, continued its rhythm. Clara immersed herself in her restoration work, yet her focus wavered more often than usual. In the quiet of the museum, when the afternoon light painted the marble floors with golden patterns, she would recall that silent presence she had felt. It unsettled her, not because she believed it meant anything, but because it stirred within her emotions she had long locked away. Adrian, in his modest apartment near Piazza Santo Spirito, sat at his piano each evening, composing fragments that seemed to emerge unbidden. He could not name their origin, but every note carried the softness of light, the texture of silence, and a strange warmth that he had not felt in years. When he listened to what he had written, he recognized in it something alive, a call, a reaching, a question yet unanswered. It was not chance, but inevitability that led them to cross paths once more. On a late September morning, Clara visited a quiet cafe tucked into an alley where time seemed slower. The aroma of espresso mingled with the rustle of newspapers, and the world outside felt far away. She had opened her notebook, sketching absent-mindedly the outlines of a frame she was restoring, when a shadow brushed across her table. Adrian entered the cafe, drawn simply by the promise of solitude. He noticed her only after ordering, when he turned and found her seated near the window. Recognition struck gently but undeniably. Though they had not exchanged words in the gallery, he remembered her stillness, the way she seemed to breathe in harmony with art itself. Clara, sensing eyes upon her, lifted her gaze, and this time it was not a fleeting glance but a meeting of presence. For a heartbeat, Florence faded, the cafe, the voices, the clinking of cups, leaving only the silent acknowledgement of two souls that had unknowingly circled each other. They exchanged polite nods, strangers still, yet no longer invisible to one another. Adrian sat a few tables away, but his thoughts betrayed him, refusing to focus on anything other than the woman by the window. Clara, too, found her sketches dissolving into meaningless lines, her mind caught in a quiet storm. That morning passed without words, but with an energy neither could dismiss. When Clara rose to leave, she felt as though she carried more than her sketchbook. She carried a question, a pull she did not understand. Adrian, watching her step into the sunlight, felt a sudden fear that this second-chance encounter might be the last, as though the city had offered him a glimpse of something he might never touch again. But fate is patient, and destiny, once awakened, seldom retreats. Over the following weeks, their worlds brushed together more often, on the bridge at twilight, at the market stalls heavy with autumn fruit, in the library where silence held more weight than words. Always it was the same, a glance, a brief nod, an unspoken recognition. Florence itself seemed to guide them, weaving their paths into closer patterns. Clara began to feel a subtle shift within herself, as if her heart was remembering how to listen. Adrian discovered that his music had grown richer, filled with crescendos and tenderness he had long forgotten. The city became a silent witness, its bells and rivers echoing their unspoken story. They were still strangers, and yet, with each fleeting encounter, the invisible thread between them tightened, unseen but undeniable. Both resisted, uncertain of what it meant, afraid of opening doors that life had once closed with pain. But beneath the fear, hope began to stir. The story of their lives was no longer separate. Something greater was at work, an unfolding destined to bring light into their carefully guarded shadows. Autumn deepened, painting Florence in shades of amber and crimson. The Arno flowed lazily beneath the bridges, carrying with it the reflection of skies that shifted from gold to violet each evening. The city breathed a quiet intimacy, as though it held secrets meant only for those willing to listen. For Clara and Adrian, the unspoken connection that had lingered between them was about to break its silence. It happened in the heart of the city, inside a small bookstore tucked between centuries-old buildings. Clara often visited this place to find rare texts on art history and restoration, drawn as much by the scent of old paper as by the wisdom it carried. Adrian had entered that same evening, searching without truly knowing what he sought. Fate once again set the stage. Clara stood by a shelf, running her fingers gently along worn spines, when a book slipped from its place and fell softly to the floor. Before she could reach for it, another hand moved instinctively, lifting it first. She looked up, and there he was, the man whose presence had followed her through weeks of chance encounters. Though no words passed, the moment stretched and held its own kind of language. Clara accepted the book, her eyes lingering just long enough to recognize something familiar in his gaze. Adrian, equally caught, felt as though he were hearing a melody return to its refrain, inevitable and unshakable. The bookstore's warmth surrounded them, but within that instant it was only the two of them, bound by something unspoken. When Clara turned back to the shelves, her heart carried a rhythm she could not deny. Adrian, leaving a few minutes later, walked into the evening with the sensation that his music had finally found its missing voice. The days that followed brought courage where hesitation had once lived. Clara, though cautious, found herself hoping to see him again, to move beyond the safety of stolen glances. Adrian, guided by both longing and music, began to visit the same streets, the same cafes, the same corners of the city, not by chance, but by quiet intent. It was inevitable that one evening, beneath the lantern strung along the Ponte Vecchio, their steps would align. Clara paused to admire the way the river shimmered like liquid fire beneath the arches, and Adrian, arriving from the opposite side, stopped as well. For a brief eternity, they stood only a few steps apart, bathed in golden light, their reflections mingling upon the water. This time, the silence was no longer enough. The thread between them had grown too strong to remain hidden. Though words had yet to be spoken, their hearts recognized each other in a way that surpassed explanation. Something had shifted. Something had begun. From that night onward, Florence no longer felt like the vast city it had been. It became smaller, more intimate, as though the streets themselves conspired to lead them together. The story that had whispered in shadows was finally preparing to speak aloud. And for the first time, both Clara and Adrian allowed themselves to believe that perhaps destiny was not a distant dream, but a hand gently guiding them toward each other. By late October, Florence had settled into the hush of cooler evenings. The tourists thinned, the air carried the faint scent of roasted chestnuts, and the city's rhythm slowed into something tender and reflective. Within this quiet season, Clara and Adrian's story began to unfold in earnest. No longer confined to fleeting glances and silent recognition, their paths intertwined with intention. They began to meet, sometimes by chance, sometimes by choice. Walks along the Arno became part of their days, their steps moving in unison as though they had walked together for years. They explored the winding streets of Oltrarno, pausing before small artisan shops, their shared silences filled with a comfortable warmth. Clara, who had once guarded her heart so fiercely, felt it softening with every encounter. She found herself noticing the gentleness in Adrian's manner, the way he carried quiet strength without arrogance, the depth of stillness in his gaze. His presence was unlike anything she had known before, neither demanding nor fleeting, but steady, as though his very existence reminded her that she did not need to rush, that love could grow in silence as much as in words. Adrian, in turn, discovered that Clara awakened something in his music he had thought forever lost. Each evening, when he returned to his piano, melodies flowed effortlessly, infused with light and tenderness. He realized that the emptiness which had haunted his compositions was now replaced by a sense of wholeness. Clara was not only inspiring him, she was transforming the way he experienced the world. Their connection deepened not through grand declarations, but through small, intimate moments. The exchange of a smile when the first raindrops of November began to fall. The pause beneath an archway as the city shimmered in silver rain, where neither rushed to leave, content to stand together as though time itself had been around them. The simple sharing of warmth, one offering a scarf, the other carrying an umbrella slightly tilted, so both could fit beneath it. Yet even as their hearts blossomed, shadows lingered. Clara wrestled with memories of betrayal, with the fear that opening her heart again might invite loss. She questioned whether she could trust the fragile beauty of what was forming. Adrian, too, carried his own doubts, burdened by the weight of a career that demanded his return to Vienna. He knew that Florence, and perhaps Clara with it, might be only a passing chapter, yet the thought of leaving her presence tightened something in his chest. Neither voiced their fears, but both felt the undercurrent of fragility within their joy. Love, they knew, was never without risk. And so, while the city witnessed their tender beginnings, an unspoken question lingered in the silence between them. Would this connection endure the trials that inevitably lay ahead? The first test was nearer than either of them realized. The world they had built of quiet walks and unspoken promises was about to be shaken. November gave way to December, and Florence, dressed in winter lights, seemed more enchanting than ever. Streets sparkled with lanterns, shop windows glowed with warmth, and the bells of distant churches rang through the crisp air. For Clara and Adrian, the season should have been a celebration of closeness. Yet, just as their hearts grew tender, the threads of fate tightened in challenge. Adrian received the letter he had both expected and dreaded, a commission in Vienna, urgent and demanding. The opportunity was too significant to dismiss, the kind of request that could not be postponed without risking his reputation and livelihood. Music, after all, had been his life long before Clara appeared. But now, the very art that had once sustained him threatened to draw him away from the fragile love that had begun to take root. Clara listened as he explained, though no words were needed to sense the weight between them. She had feared this moment, knew, in truth, that it was inevitable. He belonged to a wider world, to audiences and concert halls, while she belonged to Florence, to her work, to her past she had only just begun to mend. To follow him seemed impossible. To ask him to stay would have been selfish. Their parting was gentle, yet heavy with everything left unsaid. No promises were spoken, no declarations made. Only the silence of two souls unwilling to let go, yet forced apart by the tide of circumstance. When Adrian left for Vienna, the city seemed to exhale a colder breath. Clara's days returned to their quiet rhythm, her hands steady upon fragile canvases, but her heart trembled with absence. The streets she once walked with ease now felt empty, haunted by memories of laughter and warmth. Adrian, amidst the grandeur of Vienna's concert halls, found little comfort in applause. The music flowed, the audiences praised, but his compositions carried a hollow echo. In every note, he heard her absence. In every silence between performances, he longed for her presence. Nights stretched endlessly, his piano keys touched not with triumph, but with yearning. The distance between them was not only measured in miles, but in fears and doubts. Clara feared abandonment, that the fragile trust she had dared to build would crumble. Adrian feared failure, not in music, but in love, that he might lose the one person who had made him feel whole again. Winter pressed on, and with it came loneliness. Clara wandered the city in the quiet hours, searching the riverbanks, as if the water might carry a message across borders. Adrian, in turn, wrote melodies that no audience would hear, pieces too personal, too raw, too filled with Clara's memory to be shared. And yet, even in separation, the bond endured. The thread that had first drawn them together refused to break. Their hearts, though distant, continued to echo one another, like two instruments playing across a great space, still in harmony despite the silence between. But love cannot remain suspended forever. Choices awaited, choices that would determine whether their story was destined to fade as a beautiful memory or rise again as something lasting. The new year approached, carrying with it the promise of change. The new year dawned, and with it, an ache that neither Clara nor Adrian could ignore. Distance had tested them, silence had bruised them, yet neither could sever the invisible thread that bound their hearts. For Clara, the days grew brighter as winter melted into spring. She worked with patience, restoring not only art but also fragments of her own spirit. Yet in every brushstroke, she felt Adrian's absence like a shadow. She told herself she was strong enough to continue alone, but the truth lay heavy in her chest. She longed for him, not as a fleeting dream, but as a part of her life. Adrian, in Vienna, faced triumphs that felt strangely empty. His name echoed in concert halls, his music praised by critics, yet his soul remained restless. He realized with startling clarity that success, without Clara's presence, was little more than noise. For the first time in his life, the applause was not enough. One evening, unable to resist the pull of his own heart, Adrian left Vienna behind. With him, he carried not just his violin, but a new composition, one born of longing, hope, and love. Florence greeted him with the scent of blooming wisteria and the glow of late spring. He found Clara where he had always known she would be, in her workshop, surrounded by canvases, lost in her quiet devotion. She looked up, and in that moment time seemed to pause. Neither spoke at first. Words felt clumsy, unnecessary. Instead, Adrian placed his violin case on the table, opened it, and began to play. The melody was tender, filled with the ache of their distance, the sorrow of winter, and the promise of renewal. It was not music for an audience. It was music for her alone. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She had waited without admitting it, hoped without daring to. And now, here he was, not as a fleeting chapter, but as someone who had chosen her above all else. When the last note faded, silence filled the room. Then Adrian spoke softly, almost afraid. "Clara, the world can wait. But I can't, not anymore. You're the music I was always searching for." She stepped closer, her trembling hand finding his. The fear that had once kept her from reaching out dissolved, replaced by certainty. "And you," she whispered, "are the peace I never thought I could restore." In that embrace, past wounds no longer mattered. What lay ahead was uncertain, as all true love must be, but it was theirs to face together. Florence, with its eternal beauty, became their city not of fleeting encounters, but of lasting devotion. The river carried their reflections side by side, and the bells of the old churches rang as though celebrating their union. And so, what began as a chance meeting on an autumn morning blossomed into something far greater. A love that endured silence, distance, and fear, only to emerge stronger, like spring after the longest winter. For some stories are not meant to fade. Some are destined to remain, as eternal as music, as enduring as art, and as fragile and precious as love itself.